We'll get started with introductions and get rolling here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our last installment of our WhatsApp online meeting series for this academic year. If you're new to us, we host this event every month or every other month where we talk about new and exciting works in the field of Ottoman and Turkish studies. And you can watch all of the previous recordings in this series on our YouTube page. We will provide links to that in the chat in just a few moments. And you'll be able to watch this recording as well there within a couple of days. I also want to, before we get to today's proceedings, want to make sure everyone knows that we are running our annual prize competition, and the deadline for all submissions to our annual prizes, including our book prize, article prize, graduate student paper prize, our digital Ottoman studies prize, and several others are available on our website. And the deadline is coming up soon on June 30th. We're a little bit later than usual getting these things out and together, but we really encourage you to submit your work to these prizes as soon as you can, and by the June 30th deadline, if at all possible. We really do not want to be extending that deadline any further as it's late already. So please, get your work in, nominate your friends and colleagues, get on the horn with your students. We would really love to have a very robust field of candidates for each of these prizes. All right, with that business out of the way, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome today Dr. Samuel Hirst. Sam Hirst is an assistant professor of international relations at Bilkent University, where he has been teaching since 2017. His first book, which is the topic of today's meeting, Against the Liberal Order, the Soviet Union, Turkey, and Statist Internationalism from 1919 to 1939, came out with Oxford University Press in 2024. Currently, he's working on the political economy of the Cold War with a focus on questions of international trade and development in 1950s Turkey. He received his PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania in 2012. Sam is a dear friend of mine, and I'm so excited to have you here with us, Sam, to talk about your excellent new book. I'm gonna hand the mic over to you, where you're gonna tell us a bit about the book, and then we'll open things up for questions and answers. Sam, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that introduction. Thank you, Ipek Hocam and Alsan, for organizing. It's a pleasure to be able to discuss my work here, even if only virtually at OTSA. So I want to begin by saying that I'm joining from Sapporo, Japan, where I'm on a fellowship at Hokkaido University's Slavic Eurasian Center. And I say that both to acknowledge the center's support, but also because it's about 2 o'clock in the morning here. And so I apologize in advance because my brain is going to be working even slower than it usually does. It's hard for me to believe this, but it's been almost a year already since Against the Liberal Order came out. And in the time since then, I've recorded a few podcasts and events that are already available online. And so I thought that today I would do something a little different than the standard overview of the central argument. With the exception of Jim, since he's the discussant in a way, I don't want to assume that anyone is familiar with the book, so I will give a brief overview. But then I'm going to focus on some of the material from the middle chapters to address one aspect that might be missed if our discussion were to focus only on the big picture. So my book's subtitle includes the word statism, and this project grew out of a graduate school interest in the power of the state in Russia and in Turkey. I initially imagined this as a kind of comparative history, and pretty early on I picked the interwar period because it was a moment associated with particularly ambitious political projects, both in the Soviet Union and in Turkey. But when I began to read other scholars' work, and especially when I got into the archives, I found extensive evidence of connections between the revolutionary movements that came out of the Russian and the Ottoman empires. I was also in graduate school at a time when the idea of transnational history was in vogue. While I don't use the word transnational in the book, I was very much influenced by attempts to think about history playing out in spaces not defined by the nation state. The reason I didn't end up using the word transnational in the book is that I see what I ended up writing much more as an international history. That is, I think it's less about the actual process of crossing borders and more about the history of the international system. The main title, Against the Liberal Order, signals that this is a story that's really about the 1920s, about liberal internationalism at the end of the First World War, and the responses that that liberal internationalism begot. One standard way of thinking about the interwar period is of a Pyrrhic victory for Woodrow Wilson, a weak League of Nations because Congress rejected US membership, and then an eventual insurrection from revisionist states like Japan, Italy, and Germany. But the perspective on the interwar period from Moscow and Ankara was quite different. As the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists sought to establish new states in the aftermath of the war, the formative experience for each was foreign intervention. For the book, I drew on recent scholarship by historians like Patricia Clavin and Nicholas Mulder, historians whose work on the League of Nations and economic sanctions helped me to think about why the Bolsheviks and the Kemalists both insisted throughout the 1920s that they were afraid of the League and afraid of liberal powers. In Against the Liberal Order, I argue that what began as a military partnership, in reaction to nearly simultaneous foreign invasions, grew over the course of a decade to take on particular institutional forms. To give you a few examples of what these institutional forms were, in 1925, in opposition to the multilateralism of the League of Nations, the Soviet and Turkish governments signed a bilateral treaty. Immediately afterwards, the Soviet Foreign Commissar declared that bilateralism, based as it was on joint principles of non-aggression and neutrality, was a radically new and truly egalitarian form of international relations. Then, in 1927, as much of the world was returning to the gold standard and to multilateral trade, the Soviet Union and Turkey signed a net balance bilateral agreement. This was an early version of the clearing agreements that would become prominent globally in the 1930s. But it was also particular at this moment because it was precocious. Soviet diplomats advanced the claim that net balance was a non-exploitative form of international economic exchange, one that would allow Eastern countries to develop. In Soviet discourse, Eastern functioned both as a geographic description and as a designation for states or societies that were victims of Western imperialism. In the 1930s, the promise of development became more visible. Turkey became the most important early recipient of Soviet industrial credits, and Soviet engineers helped establish textile factories in Kayseri and Nazilli. My subtitle identifies these various forms of international exchange as a kind of statist internationalism. That phrase was not in use at the time, but I think it helps to emphasize that many of the individuals involved in Soviet-Turkish exchanges saw what they were doing as an internationalism that was at odds with what was happening in Paris and in Geneva. Occasionally, one can find people like İsmet İnönü or Karl Radek actually trying to explain the Soviet-Turkish relationship in terms that might be described as statist nationalism. In the two instances that I'm thinking of, İsmet and Radek both began by acknowledging the ideological difference between the communist Soviet Union and nationalist Turkey. But after acknowledging ideological difference, they then went on to argue that in a world dominated by powerful states, states that advocated limits on sovereignty in the name of liberalism and interconnectedness, less developed agricultural societies needed to use the power of the state to cooperate in the name of late development. That is, in the name of catching up. In one of those moments that was almost too good to be true as a historian, I found that the lathes the Soviet Commissariat of Light Industry sent to Turkey were of a model that was called catch up and overtake. One of the things that my book does is to challenge the idea that Soviet-Turkish cooperation was pragmatic. During the Cold War, that claim, I think, made sense. There's little evidence that Soviet diplomats or trade representatives were ideological in their approach to Turkey in the sense that they were looking for socialist revolution. And I didn't see any evidence that most Turkish merchants or diplomats or even journalists who engaged with the Soviet Union were ideological in the sense that they concealed sympathies for socialism. But the idea of pragmatism is insufficient because there's loads of evidence that there was something quite ideological in the way that many of these individuals understood international hierarchy and the international system itself. I ended up not trying to answer my original question, which was comparative, about the respective power of the state in Moscow and Ankara. I did, however, come to the conclusion that the nature of liberal internationalism led, in both the Soviet Union and Turkey, to the valorization of the state, becoming a part of what connected the individuals who traveled between these two countries in the interwar period. I'm moving pretty quickly here through some of the bigger claims, and I'll be happy to speak more about any of them during the discussion. But for now, I'm going to move to a couple of stories which are in the middle chapters of the book. A historian whom I respect very much has sometimes told me that I speak like a political scientist. He didn't say it as a compliment. I think it's probably a good thing since I work in a department of international relations, but I was trained as a historian, and I do believe that what I wrote is a work of history. One of the things that I fear gets lost when I speak in general terms about the argument is the sense that this was a story of learning processes. That is, this was not a structural opposition between liberal internationalism in the abstract and inherently statist opponents. Rather, these were specific groups of individuals learning to cope with a particular post-World War I instantiation of liberal internationalism. One thing that has probably already become apparent in my comments is that this book features more Soviet voices than it does Turkish ones. This is partly because I was trained as a Russian historian, and although I do speak Turkish, my Russian is still more fluent. I also found archival access easier in Russia. That is, getting into the archives in Turkey is very easy. It's easier than getting into the Russian archives, but once you have access in Russia, more material has been declassified. You may ask then why I'm speaking at OTSA, but I do believe that approaching from the Soviet Union adds something to our understanding of early Republican Turkey. I'll try and be very specific about what I think that is as I get towards the end of this talk. After having ascertained that the factories in Kayseri and Nazilli were important, and after ascertaining that trade credit was crucial to making those factories happen, I went back and tried to understand the nature of Soviet-Turkish trade in the 1920s. And as I went through the archives of the Soviet Commissariat of Foreign Trade, I found consistent references to the need to trade with ethnic Turks. You may perhaps wonder about the terminology there, and I can add that the phrase used most frequently in Russian was Turецkiy kuptsi, that is, Turkish merchants. It was an ethnic or a national description, not a religious one. At home, the Soviet approach to ethnicity was federation. But I found that in Turkey, Soviet trade representatives and diplomats favored an ethnically homogenous Turkish nation state, or at least they preferred to act with representatives of Turkey who they could identify as such. And this fact struck me as important because I was familiar with the work of Rıfat Bali, Ayhan Aktar, Murat Koraltürk, and others. I knew that foreign diplomatic sources had played a significant role in historians' accounts of the Turkification of the economy in the early Turkish Republic. But whereas British and French diplomats lodged protests about violations of the rights of non-Turkish minorities, Soviet diplomats played along with and even encouraged the process of Turkification. Given the internationalism of official Soviet ideology, I thought this was a puzzle that was worth exploring. In chapter 4 of Against the Liberal Order, I offer something like a collective portrait of the Soviet Union's first Turkey specialists. These were something like area studies scholars, the first generation in the Soviet Union. These individuals were almost all male, included people like Vladimir Gurko-Kryazhin, Georgy Astakhov, and Konstantin Yust. These are just a few of the names. I write about more, but by no means all in the book. I selected individuals based on who was writing publicly about Turkey, based on who was shaping the Soviet understanding of Kemalist politics. It would be hard to speak about this group in terms of a single profession. Almost all worked for a newspaper at some point, but they were more than journalists. Most worked for a while as a diplomat or as a commercial agent in Ankara or Istanbul. Many taught at universities for some period. Some probably had ties to Soviet intelligence. One common thread that tied the group together was that almost all of them wrote poetry, and especially in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution. These were young men. They were generally between 25 and 30 in 1917. They were university trained, and they were idealist. I can't say that the poetry is terribly good, but in a sense that makes it easier to decipher its meaning. In one of my favorite poems, Hirst imagines, this is 1917, Hirst imagines how the First World War would end, and he predicts that Frenchmen will be kissing Germans and Brits will be kissing Indians. In other words, right at the end of the First World War, many of the Soviet Union's Turkey specialists were on record with an internationalism that was critical of ethnic nationalism. For these men, the connection to Turkey came often through service in the Caucasus, either in the Red Army or the Bolshevik Party. They didn't come through the Russian Empire's Oriental Studies institutes, but had generally studied law because they were interested in politics. Often, by chance, they ended up either in Baku or Tbilisi, and then in the tumult of the Russian Civil War, they were posted to Turkey or assigned Turkey-related work. The basic decision to send military and financial aid to the Kemalists was taken in the Kremlin, without any input from these individuals. And the basic decision to form a partnership with the Kemalists fit into Marxist-Leninist ideology in a broad sense, in the sense that Marxism-Leninism embraced anti-imperialism. But Lenin and Stalin didn't have time to study Turkish politics and history, and it fell to the second rank of young men to figure out the ideological complexities of an anti-imperialist partnership. It was on the ground in Anatolia that Astakhov and Yust embraced a more nationalist anti-imperialism. To some extent, this was an immediate reaction to Western powers' defense of minority rights, but it was also connected to an emerging class analysis of Turkey. The Soviet consensus was that there was no proletariat in Turkey, and that the Kemalists' core constituency was the bourgeoisie. But the bourgeoisie was supposed to be the enemy, and there was quite a feeling of camaraderie between many of the Soviet visitors and their Kemalist hosts. So how were Astakhov and Yust to explain the progressive aspects of Kemalist politics? Gradually, they came to describe class divisions in geographic and ethnic terms. They argued that Western imperialism had fostered economic growth in Turkey's major port cities, in particular in Istanbul and Izmir. They argued that a bourgeoisie had emerged in the ports that was largely non-Turkish. I was able to identify the Russian language phrase port bourgeoisie, that is portovaya bourgeoisie, as something that was particular to analysis of Turkey. By the late 1920s, this phrase was largely replaced by the word comprador and the idea of a comprador class. These would become standard elements of Marxist thought later in the 20th century. And these latter terms were imported from discussions of China. But Soviet policy towards Turkey and China were quite different, and the references to a port bourgeoisie, a particularly Turkish term, that is a Soviet term about Turkey, helps to identify the emergence of a distinctive set of policies. vis-a-vis Turkey. With class enemies firmly established and located in Izmir and Istanbul, Soviet writers were then able to articulate a positive historical role for the Kemalists. They came to speak of the Kemalists as representatives of what they called the Anatolian bourgeoisie, because the port bourgeoisie had captured the profits of Turkey's export agriculture and maritime trade. The Anatolian bourgeoisie, it was supposed, was going to have to industrialize. Industrialization, then, could be a common goal for both Russian socialists and bourgeois Kemalists. The Soviet appreciation of Turkish statism, that is what would become known as devletçilik, came out of this class analysis. Significantly, the first Soviet academic work on statism in Turkey was published in 1928. This is quite a bit before the idea of statism had come to be prominently discussed in Turkey. The author of this Soviet book, Vladimir Asyatrov, pointed to Turkish government monopolies. That was his early evidence of statism. And he argued that because the Anatolian bourgeoisie was relatively poor, the Turkish state would have to play a key role in capital accumulation. If what I'm describing sounds very schematic, it was anything but. When Asyatrov published his book, which was titled The Driving Forces of the Kemalist Revolution, he came under vicious public attack from a group who argued that he had sold out the Turkish peasantry, that is, he had sold out the cause of Marxism in Turkey. We can also see the contested nature of the emerging Soviet narrative in the story of Vladimir Gurko-Kryazhin, who was one of the most prominent Turkey specialists in the Soviet Union. As a side note, I would say that it was Gurko-Kryazhin who wrote the introduction to the Russian language translation of Mustafa Kemal Pasha's great speech, the Nutuk. Gurko-Kryazhin was slightly older than Hirst and Asyatrov, and he was a book-trained Soviet Orientalist. He didn't actually spend time in Ankara or Turkey. And in the early 1920s, he was openly critical of the Kemalists' hostility towards non-Turks. He argued that the Kemalists would do better to adopt the principle of multi-ethnic federation, as the Bolsheviks had done for the organization of the Soviet Union. But then in 1925, you can see a real shift in Gurko-Kryazhin's writing. All of a sudden, he started to praise the Kemalists' Turkification of industry. He acknowledged that the Kemalists' economic policies were, and here I quote, objectively beneficial for the Anatolian population. For many of the key passages, Gurko-Kryazhin cited the works of comrades who were or had been based in Turkey. I don't think that this was a moment of sudden realization or academic persuasion. It's much more likely that Gurko-Kryazhin sensed that the party line was changing, or perhaps he was told that the party line was changing. For this kind of intellectual history, causality is something very difficult to prove. I did find evidence that these Turkey specialists directly intervened in the day-to-day workings of the Soviet trade delegation. They argued that Soviet institutions should trade with this and not that Turkish company. But I would be hesitant to say that these ideas played a decisive role in the general course of Soviet-Turkish relations. Rather, I would point out that by the time that Soviet engineers were installing machinery in a factory in Kayseri, it was part of a consistent worldview. To come back to the earlier point about ideology and pragmatism, I don't think we need evidence that the Bolsheviks were hoping that Kayseri's workers would lead a revolution in order to recognize that factory construction was more than a pragmatic commercial transaction. By the 1930s, the Soviet understanding of Turkey favored central Anatolian towns like Kayseri, and it saw state-led industrialization as historical progress. This came partly out of the Soviet Union's own experience, but it was also shaped by these young idealists who reacted to their experience in Turkey. Western dominance of maritime trade in Izmir and Istanbul was a key part of their analysis. I don't have time to connect this maritime trade directly to the idea of liberalism as such, or to a liberal order, But in the book, I show that the Soviets were thinking about the liberalism of Fethi Okyar and the Serbest Cumhuriyet as a part of this schema. While I acknowledge that there are fewer Turkish voices in the book, that doesn't mean there aren't any. After figuring out the Soviet story, I then asked what the mirror image would be. In other words, how did the Kemalist understanding of the Soviet Union evolve over the course of the interwar period? I found that if the mid-1920s was a turning point in the Soviet Union, the analog in Turkey was in the early 1930s. Fali Rifka Atay's Yeni Rusya, which was published in 1931, and then a spate of publications in connection with Ismet Pasha's visit to the Soviet Union in 1932, were a concerted attempt to shape the public image in Turkey of the Soviet Union. Often, Kemalist writers were quite explicit that they were trying to change what they believed was a false image. The argument was that previously, Turkey had relied too heavily for knowledge about the Soviet Union on translations from French and English. The argument was that Western liberal writers were prone to see socialism everywhere. If Soviet writers created an ideological schema in which the state played a progressive role, the Turkish analog really was a mirror image. That is, at this moment in the early 1930s, a host of prominent Kemalists or state-affiliated writers began to downplay the role of ideology in Soviet politics. People who accompanied Ismet on his trip to the Soviet Union, that is, people like Mahmut Soydan of Milliyet, Yakub Kadri Karaosmanoğlu, they argued that the prominent role of the Soviet state and the Soviet commitment to industrialization came not so much from Marx or Lenin, but from the fact that the Russian Empire had been an underdeveloped agricultural society. There was occasional reference to Western banks having played a similar role in the Russian Empire to the role that Western banks played in the Ottoman Empire. But the Kemalist reaction to this liberal image of the Soviet Union was essentially the very embrace of statism, the argument that statism was sort of a technocratic process rather than an ideological one. To be clear, Kemalist writers did not use the word devletçilik when they wrote about the Soviet Union. Devletçilik was assumed to be Turkish, and what was happening in the Soviet Union was identifiably not connected to what was happening in Turkey. But they argued that Soviet methods, Soviet industry and industrialization were defined by the interests of state rather than the interests of socialist ideology, and therefore they were transferable. As the Kemalists borrowed Soviet methods, they then appropriated and refashioned them. The Soviet model of industrialization favored heavy industry, and Turkey did not develop heavy industry until much later. When Ismet traveled to the Soviet Union, Moscow offered a range of things, including tractors to develop agriculture. Textiles were a Turkish choice. What I've described then was, from two very different starting points, a statist convergence. The endpoint was not the same statism. The nature of industry in the Soviet Union and Turkey and the role of the state in these two societies continued to be very different throughout the interwar period. But for a brief moment in the middle of the 1930s, I think it's pretty clear that prominent Bolsheviks and Kemalists recognized that state-led economic cooperation had become the basis of an international relationship. A year ago, I would have wrapped up here with comments about liberal internationalism or the crisis of the liberal international order. Today, that crisis seems so far advanced that I'm not sure anyone is interested in hearing any more about liberal internationalism. Should there be interest, I'm happy to talk about contemporary relevance during the discussion, but since this is OTSA, I thought I might offer a few thoughts at the end here about how I see my book contributing to the history of the early Turkish Republic. The book is based on extensive archival research, and I hope that there'll be something here even for those unpersuaded by my broader interpretations. I have a personal website where I'm trying to make available translations of some of the archival documents, progress is slower than I would like, and there's only one document there so far, but it's a long and rich one. It's a Soviet document that includes phrases and ideas that I've referred to today, including port bourgeoisie. So if you want to read more, that's there. For those willing to entertain the argument, I would suggest the following. During the Cold War, the record of Soviet-Turkish cooperation in the interwar period was intentionally downplayed. Relatively speaking, it was extremely unusual for a foreign state in the 1930s to be building factories equipped with Soviet machinery. Turkey was really, really unusual in the interwar period. And so in the 1950s, when Soviet industrial exports to Egypt and to India were just beginning, the Soviet exports to Turkey in the 1930s could not be ignored. And I think that it was at this moment that the language of pragmatism came in. Bernard Lewis's Emergence of Modern Turkey is a prime example of an author pointing to Soviet industrial aid just to dismiss it as something that had no ideological or political relevance. I think that it was in part because the Soviet connection was such an important part of Kemalist economic policy that we ended up with accounts of Turkish nationalism or Turkish modernization that focused much more on social and cultural policies. While the works on Turkification of the economy that I referred to earlier have done much to correct that, I think that we can go even further. If we're to take the Soviet-Turkish connection seriously, it requires us to recognize how important economic policy was to Kemalist politics and how international the political context for that economic policy was. I see my work very much in line with some of the recent work on transnational Kemalism, that is arguing that we should treat Kemalism as a transnational phenomenon. I also see it in line with works that aren't particularly about Turkey, but are about the 1930s and point to illiberal internationalisms. While 20th century nationalists often rejected internationalism in its liberal variant, this did not mean that they rejected internationalism as such. I hope that one of the things that my book does in relation to the history of modern Turkey is to demonstrate how integral new forms of international exchange were to the nationalist project. That is, I hope that we can more and more write interwar Turkey into the history of what Adam Geraciu calls world making, that is, nationalism as an international politics. I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Sam, thank you so much. I'm going to take the liberty to provide a few, broad reactions and questions embedded there in, if I might. This is a project I've been, I guess on the watching developed for over a decade now, and it's informed a lot of my own work. And Sam has been a good hobby to me over many years personally. So it's really, I want to say, it's been really fantastic to spend time with the finished product. And I always, I mean, every time I pick up Sam's work, I'm learning something new and challenging something that I thought I knew already. So I really do want to encourage everyone to read this book. And Sam, I think, is maybe a bit too modest in positioning himself as a Russianist first and a historian of Turkey second. I think those are, if you read the book, they're more co-equal than he lets on in terms of both relevance and in terms of the legwork in the archives that goes into it. In terms of, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I really appreciate that you zeroed in on those middle chapters, because they were also the chapters that I think stood out to me the most as well, and especially as a Turkish historian. But I think just broadly, I mean, what the book does, for those who haven't read it, that I think is really interesting, is sort of demonstrate how the what we understand to be these global ideological battles that I mean, we're more familiar with them in the Cold War context, but really were forming between, communism and capitalism in the 20s and 30s, shaped chemalism as it existed in so many ways. This is what Sam's giving us here is a history of ideology and political economy in so many ways, in addition to being a history of an international history. It is a history that shows how flexible and Soviet ideology was to adapt to the end goal of partnership, or the goal of partnership with Turkey. It shows how Kemalism adapted and amalgamated aspects of Soviet ideology underneath its rubric, both while maintaining connections to a Western economy, right? The sort of paradox of Kemalism that we've known for a long time as being anti-imperialist, but westernizing at the same time, I think is made much more rich by understanding the sort of political economy and international politics of Kemalism vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in this period. I think that's really, really important. To the chapters that you referenced specifically, I would say, in addition to what you said, Sam, I mean, for me, when I was reading these chapters, I was really struck by how you've sketched this group of Orientalists or Turkey experts who undergo a process that has its cognates in Turkish opposition figures and in observers from the West, and that process is actually a process of intentional historical forgetting of interethnic violence, as you put it. I mean, you go through great pains to show how these are all figures that not only are they the closest thing that the Soviet Union has to experts, but they also know quite intimately the gory details of interethnic violence, including the genocide of Armenians, including reprisals against Greeks, detail them in their works. Karajan, I don't think you mentioned, if I remember this incorrectly, you can correct me, but is married to an Armenian woman, or his second wife is Armenian. And the process that each of these figures, as you said, it ultimately contributes to the political goal of Turkifying the Turkish economy, right? And in that process, elides, forgets, erases a history they know all too well, right? And we've seen countless in the historiography of Turkey and Turkish intellectuals and opposition figures. We've seen this same process play out, albeit with different, maybe different ideological means and ends. But we have examples of figures, who are so impressed by what Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish economy is able to do in the 20s and early 30s that they're willing to forget, the horrible things that they had witnessed in the past. The same goes for, I think you could find the story amongst American diplomats, amongst British and French and German and so on. Everyone around the world seems so impressed by this industrialization for one reason or another that they're willing to forget these things. And I think you've added a Soviet element to this, which is, I think, really, really crucial and important, because it shows not just that the Soviets were susceptible to this as well, but that it helped shape their understanding of the political interaction between Turkey and the Soviet Union. And that I guess one question I have drawing out of that is that in those other cases we've also seen how later efforts to remember that history of interethnic violence have also been sort of contingent on geopolitics and regional politics in the region. And I'm curious if you can say a few things to about how, pulling the story a little bit further, whether or not these figures ultimately forget that they forgot, about interethnic violence in this period, or come back around, or the Soviet how does the Soviet Union come back around to recognizing interethnic violence later on, and why? Um, uh, there's a lot else I could say, but I do want to mention one other I think important contribution to Turkish historiography here, and then I'll give you a chance to respond, and we can ask a few questions that have come in over the chat. I was curious, how you see this work positioned within, or what this book offers to the history of Turkish communism and Turkish leftism. And as I read it, and you I think tell part of the story, very explicitly in the book about how the Soviet partnership with the Kemalists was, in many ways, over and above objections by or interests of indigenous Turkish communists and leftists, many of whom, by the way, were, as you well know, members of that bourgeoisie, right? Or came out of those circles specifically, right? And this is unsurprising to me because I've studied these movements, and I have a pretty good sense of how little support they got politically from the Comintern and other places. But I'm curious, I want to know, how do you see that fitting into the broader historiography of leftism and communism in Turkey, which has its own sort of characteristics, and what you think it contributes there. So I'll leave my comments at that, and we can open things up to questions. Feel free to raise your hand, and we'll unmute you. But I'll give Sam a chance to respond to any of that word salad I just put out there that he so wishes. I know it's still early morning hours for you, Sam, but I'll give you that chance first, and then we'll field a few more questions.
Thanks very much, Jim, for that response. Thank you very, very much for your kind words about the book. I should say from my side that it was wonderful having Jim as a colleague in graduate school, and I've learned much from him and from his work as well. So I'm going to pull out two questions that you raised explicitly, Jim, and because they're very interesting ones, and respond to them first. So you asked whether some of these figures who I write about, who forgot, or I think forgot is pushing it too far. They explained. They found an explanation for themselves of why the interethnic violence had happened, why it could be forgotten, why it didn't matter so much once the page had been turned. Often this was an explanation of based on ideas of British and French imperialism, and what European imperialism having been the inciting factor in this violence. And you asked whether any of these figures later remembered that they had forgotten. And so one way to answer the question is that many of them were shot in 1937 and 1938. It was inconvenient, to say the least, to have connections to such deep connections to a foreign country, a non-socialist country, a capitalist country, a country especially that was beginning to improve relations with Britain, with Germany. And many of the Turkey specialists that I write about died in the Great Purges. I do have one example that I think is interesting, a man by the name of Sergei Glyabov. This was someone who served in Turkey in 1922, 1923. And he tried to publish at that time. His work was not, he wrote at the time about his experience in Turkey, and he tried to publish it in the 1930s, and his attempt to publish was denied. And in the Cold War period, he actually tried to bring his work back and argue that it could be published now. This was at a moment when Soviet-Turkish relations were beginning to improve. And so it really wasn't a case of remembering the idea of hostility, but trying to capitalize on his investment in Soviet-Turkish relations. But that's sort of an anecdote rather than, I think, a sort of a more broad-ranging response to your question. Because the other part of your question was how this process of forgetting changed as geopolitics changed. I think that's probably the more important side of the story. And so in 1945, as Soviet-Turkish relations really deteriorated, I mean, they had begun to deteriorate already in the late 1930s, but they get really, really tense, hostile in 1945. And at that moment, you begin to see claims from coming in. They had existed before this, but they come in much louder from Armenia, from Georgia, and from elsewhere, that the interests of various peoples had been sacrificed in the name of a diplomatic partnership. That the Soviet-Turkish interstate relationship of the 1920s and the 1930s had led to a whole host of questions being shelved. And that comes back in 1945 and doesn't go away. That it becomes much more contested after 45. So I hope that speaks to that first set of questions. Your second question was about Turkish leftism and how my focus on the interstate relationship between Moscow and Ankara contributes to our understanding of leftism. One of the documents that I'm hoping to publish on my website is a 1932 report by Yakov Suritz, the Soviet ambassador in Ankara, writing to Moscow in advance of Ismet Pasha's visit, explaining this is what the Turkish political spectrum looks like at this moment. And he describes various groups. And the document is very, very interesting for many reasons. But one of the parts that I appreciated most was a description of the Kadro movement. And Kadro was a group whose analysis really corresponded in important ways to the Soviet analysis of Turkey. And yet Suritz was scathing about Kadro, saw them as Trotskyites, saw them as the enemy. And he was much more positive about Ismet. He's much more positive about Recep Peker. And this is, if we think in sort of standard ideological terms, this is puzzling. But I think it comes out of a couple of things. One is that Stalin, I'm going to exaggerate, but I want to say that Stalin hated Trotsky more than he hated Hitler. That is one's closest enemies are those who are most threatening in ideological terms. And I think this was part of the fear of figures in Turkey associated with leftist thought, but who are not members of the Communist Party, who are not subordinate to the Comintern. So I think that's part of what's going on. But I think that there's also something that's not necessarily related to leftism, which is that if you look at the later course of the Soviet-Turkish relationship, in the 1960s, the Soviet Union is just as happy to work with Süleyman Demirel as they are to work with Bülent Ecevit. And there's this sense that when you're dealing with, well, first I would say that the Soviet Union really commits in diplomatic terms to interstate relations, to a vision of foreign policy as between sovereign states. And one really has to look beyond questions of ideology outside of the socialist bloc. So there's that. But then there's also, I think there's something specific to Turkey, which is that in the case of an underdeveloped state or an Eastern state, the terms would change. But the Soviet Union consistently described Turkey as not Western or not fully Western after Turkey joins NATO. And when you're dealing with an underdeveloped state, country, then the state itself plays this role in capital accumulation, in development, that means that that as an industrializing power, as a power that's exporting industry, you really bet on the state itself. And so you asked about what this tells us about Turkish leftism. I think that one way of explaining, you said, Jim, you weren't surprised to find that the Soviets not terribly supportive of Turkish leftists. And I think one way that that is often explained is that the Soviet Union is pragmatic, that the Soviet Union sacrifices the left in Turkey for geopolitics or pragmatism. And obviously there's some truth to that. But what I'm trying to do in my work is suggest that there's something really quite ideological in the Soviet bet on the Turkish state. And it comes out of an ideological reading of geopolitics, one in which developing states have a particular role, in which the Soviet Union has a particular role between the developed West and the underdeveloped states of what would come to be known as the Third World. And so then I would just respond to one last thing that you said, which is that, and so I really appreciate, I always appreciate hearing my research described in someone else's words. And I appreciated the way you described the Soviet evolution that I focused on in my comments today as being something that we can see for British or American observers of Turkey, which we can see for the Turkish opposition itself. And I think that that's right. And this is one of the ways that I describe this in the introduction to Against the Liberal Order is that one of the important stories in the book is the way that the Soviet Union embraced nationalism, national political economy. And I think so it's not just, and this is not what you were saying, but more than adding the Soviet Union to the story, we've got an explicitly anti-nationalist, an explicitly internationalist set of individuals who are embracing nationalism in the context of 20th century world politics. And I think part of the way that to explain this is by referring to the nature of liberal internationalism as I do in the book. Liberal internationalism, because it insisted on limiting sovereignty, generated a defense of sovereignty among those who sought to resist it. Early on, the Bolsheviks do not care about the concept of sovereignty. They talk about, they talk about sort of labor internationalism. They don't really care about the sovereignty of states. And that's true in the abstract. It's also true in relation to Turkey. You can see early on many of the Soviet diplomats telling the Kemalists, when the Kemalists are insisting, respect our sovereignty, the Soviets say, no, no, no. Let's focus on trade. Let's focus on development. And if we have to bend the law here and there, it's worth it. And gradually, the Soviet Union comes to appreciate Turkey's concerns about sovereignty. And by 1945, Soviet diplomats at the United Nations are yelling at the top of their lungs about the need to defend sovereignty. And so, yes, this is an appreciation of the successes of nationalism in Turkey, but it's also a recognition that nationalism is a very, very convenient tool for pushing back against liberal internationalism as it existed in the 1920s and the 1930s.
Thanks so much for that, Sam. We have one question in the chat, which I'll read back just for the folks who are watching this later on YouTube. It comes from Wayne Bowen. He asks, to what extent do interwar Turkish-Soviet relations follow the path of pre-World War I imperial German and Ottoman Empire collaboration? trying to find an alternative to the dominance of and dependency on France and Britain in the area of trade, modernization, and armaments.
Thank you for that question. And I suppose I would give two answers. One is that in the 1920s, when the Turkish government is negotiating with the Soviet Union, the Turkish lobbying often involves pointing to dependence on Britain and France. And there's this sense that from Turkish diplomats, the Soviet Union needs to increase its investments in Turkey, needs to increase trade with Turkey to help Turkey lessen dependence on Britain and France. In the 1930s, Turkish diplomats began talking about dependence on Germany, again in conversations with the Soviet Union, arguing that the Soviet Union needs to increase investments in Turkey and increase trade with Turkey because of dependence on Germany. And so I think in almost structural terms, we can see this, the idea, the language of balancing being a consistent part of thinking about state pressures and the state drive to increase economic ties. But in the book, I talk much less about economic models, and I try to focus on concrete examples of the transfer of ideas and practices. And in that sense, there really is continuity from the Ottoman German pre-war connection. Initially, when I was imagining this project and I was thinking about the early 1920s, I was thinking about a triangle that might have involved Germany and early Soviet Russia and Turkey, because there were connections among the three. And if you look at where a lot of Lenin's ideas about state organization come from, the role of the state in economy, much of that comes out of German policy during the First World War. So that is, when Ismet is looking to the Soviet Union in 1932 and thinking about statism, he is, in a sense, seeing an adaptation of earlier German policy. And many of the Turkish statists in the 1930s are also influenced by German political economy. And I think the clearest example of this connection would be Parvus Effendi or Alexander Helpand, someone who is again moving between German and Ottoman political economies during the First World War, and also between German and Soviet political economies. And you asked about sort of continuity in terms of trying to find alternatives to British and French dominance. And I would say that this is one of the through lines. The sense is that conditions of freer international trade, freer international investment, give an advantage to states with economic power. And for late developing states, as Turkey and the Soviet Union were by the 1920s, the state was a necessary response to the power of the free market.
All right, thank you, Sam. We are just about at an hour here, so I want to, unless there is another urgent, pressing question out there, we might close it off here. But thank you all for coming, and Sam, thank you once again for getting up way too early in Sapporo to be with us tonight. Today here, your night. This really is a fantastic book. I encourage everybody to go out and read it. I did, want to also mention again, if you're watching this, in the next week or so, please do visit our website and send your work in for one of our awards or prizes. Again, that deadline is coming up very, very soon. So thank you once again, Sam. Thanks to Alison Cullum and Ipek Yosmolu, who are also here helping and part of the team that helps make OTSA go. This is our last, as I said, WhatsApp session, but we will be back in the fall in September. So stay tuned for more information on that front, and we'll be with you all again soon.